So, welcome to a new Whiskey and History podcast. And today I have a special guest, one of my good friends, Matt LeMasters. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
How's it going, buddy?
Good. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Matt. Like, what do you like to do? Tell us about yourself, research-wise, all that fun junk.
Yeah, so where do I really start? First of all, Springfield, Illinois, born and raised. Got my associates at Lincoln Land Community College, and then got my bachelor's in history at U of I here in Springfield. Of course, we both went there, but we've been friends a long time before then.
Yes.
Going back to, what was it? I think like 8th grade.
I think so.
Is about when we met. I'm really happy to be here. A little bit about, I guess, myself and my interest in history, specifically some of what we'll be talking about today. I've had an infatuation with history ever since I was a kid. I always say that it was the first Call of Duty that came out back in 2003.
Classic.
Yeah, I distinctly remember. I'm talking the original Call of Duty. A lot of people say, oh yeah, I played the first Call of Duty. It was finest hour. And I'm like, no, I'm talking the first. It was just called Call of Duty. But anyhow, I distinctly remember I played that campaign over and over and over. And then, my brother, he's a little bit older than me. And one night we would frequently drive around in his red Chevy Z75. The last that I heard, that thing is still going. It's from the 90s.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that thing is a tank. But anyhow, when we were driving around, I was like, Brad, is Call of Duty about World War I? And he said, no, World War II. And I was like, ever since then, my life changed.
That's crazy.
But yeah, so, especially in terms of military history, I focus specifically on the 20th century mainly. World War I that we'll be talking about today, but, also World War II in Korea. Pretty much most of my dad's side of the family served in World War II. And then on my mom's side, my grandpa was in Korea. And then I think before that, the only other family member was from the Civil War. Now his wife, my grandma, she had some family that was also in, I found out recently was in World War I and the Civil War as well. So, just having that personal connection to history.
That's awesome.
That's what really brings it home to me. I think a lot of people think history is, just these big events and, you have these leaders. But for me, history is all about, the everyday person, so to speak.
Yeah. I think with history, we get focused on the big popular figures like Washington, Lincoln, the major generals in these wars. And then the forgotten everyday story of these soldiers that the ones that fought these wars are kind of forgotten about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. I think, at least in the case of World War II, Korea and Vietnam, those generations are still around. World War II, not so much as it used to be, obviously.
Yeah.
But, I think a lot of people, they have this, that's their personal connection to, that period in history is, oh, yeah, my dad, he was in World War II, or grandpa was in World War II, or whoever.
Yeah.
And then, so I think that's the one example of people who have that personal connection. But otherwise, I think, for most people, history is just something you learn in high school.
I think most things people just look at history as boring, the same, let's learn our vocabulary terms and just close the book, and you miss so much.
Yeah.
And that's what I love. That's what we're going to talk about is some personal stories related to Illinois. We're, like Matt said, we're from Illinois. Both of us born and raised in Springfield. I love Illinois history. That's what you're going to see with this podcast, like I talk about, and this is why I have Matt on. And the other interesting thing, real quick, before we get started, real quick, your family member that fought in the Civil War, were they a Yankee or a Rebel?
He was a Yankee.
Yes!
He was okay, so I'll go ahead and go off the rails slightly.
Sorry.
I'm not a I'm not a big Civil War nerd just because living in Springfield, you get Lincoln shoved down your throat pretty much your whole life and it's all around you.
Yes.
So my relative that served in the Civil War, there were actually two, I should say. Originally, I thought there was only one. So his name was William Valentine. He was in Company H of the 7th Illinois Cavalry, which I don't know much about this, but was a part of Grierson's raid, apparently.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of these days, this is probably a year or two ago, I was just looking around on Find a Grave, and I found him on there, and then I saw his father also had a military grave. And his father, so William is the one, he was the younger one, obviously. So he enlisted, and then I found his father ended up enlisting later and served in the same company with him. He ended up getting put. Wow. So the father and son served in the same exact cavalry company in the Civil War. It was
that's badass.
Kind of crazy. And they're buried in the middle of Podunk, nowhere, Illinois. It's I can't remember the name of it. That's how small it is. So,
it happens. It happens.
Right.
That's Illinois for you. Lots of small towns. Everyone just thinks of Illinois as Chicago.
Right. Well, whoever. Usually on Find a Grave, obviously you have to connect family members to each other manually, and whoever did that, I ended up keep going back further and further for that family, and whoever did it, I think, has them traced back to the 1600s.
Wow. Unfortunately, I don't have the family history of my family. Does not go back that far.
Right.
To the founding fathers or the Civil War. Well, I wish. Right.
Well, that's my mom's side of the family. My dad's side, I know my great-grandfather, LeMasters, was born in New Mexico in the 1800s, I think. His wife, so my great-grandmother, Julia Klemek, she was born here too, but I haven't really gone back any further than that, but I do know, we have a lot of Irish, Czech, German, Polish. We're just European mutts. We're American, so.
Hey, nothing wrong with that.
And that's me talking about European immigrants is going to be part of this too, with what I got to talk about here. So.
And real quick too, before we get started, we're also drinking one of my favorite whiskeys, Crown Royal.
You are.
I am. Matt decided to not drink with me today. I'll drink for him.
I decided to stay sober for the afternoon.
It happens, I can't. I have to have a little bit of fun here.
Yeah, but you also live here. You don't have to drive. So.
True. So, all right. So let's get started with what we wanted to talk about. Obviously, we're going to talk about World War I, one of Matt's favorite eras. I can't speak. One of Matt's favorite eras to talk about. And like I said earlier, he's researching a World War I Illinois regiment?
Division/regiment.
Yeah.
I can kind of go into that.
All right, so we'll just go into it. Explain what you're doing.
Okay. So I guess where do I start with this? I guess to kind of back up a little bit with kind of my background. Like I said, obviously born and raised here in Springfield, but I currently live down in Collinsville, down in Madison County, and I'm probably 15 minutes from downtown St. Louis. And really, my interest in World War I specifically, I think like a lot of people, World War II is like the main grappling historical event in terms of military conflicts in the 20th century. And World War I just kind of sits in the background a little bit.
Yeah, we don't talk about, I never learned much about the First World War. I still really don't know much.
Right.
Sitting here.
Right. World War I was something that I always, I mean, like I was saying, like World War II has always been my bread and butter. World War I always took an interest in, but it wasn't until probably 6 months or so ago that I really started to get into World War I. So living here in Springfield, I did a lot of volunteering at the Illinois State Military Museum near Camp Lincoln, and
which is an awesome place.
It is. It
looks like an old castle.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember the exact history, but I think it's the old like Springfield Armory here in town, or it might have been State Armory.
It was State Armory.
It was? Okay.
The Armory got
So
burned
you know
down.
more than I do.
It got burned down. Which, that is actually going to be a future podcast episode. I've done research on it.
Okay, awesome.
It's been announced.
Right. But yeah, I was very fortunate to volunteer there. And of course, I do reenactments and living history displays. So that's, the majority of my volunteer work out there was, setting up for people who came out, just kind of talk with them, about the, again, quote unquote, personal side of military history. And of course, to repeat myself again, I was always into World War II. So that's mostly what I did out there. But I know every time I went to the museum, I always knew like there was this huge focus on World War I. In fact, I think most of the museum's collection
is World War I.
Is World War I.
Yeah, they have some pretty cool exhibits.
Right.
Yeah.
And in 2018, I believe, I took a summer internship there, which was really nice. It's like, I already know everybody here. It's not like a regular internship where, I've got to go get the coffee for the boss and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
But basically, the curator at the time, he had a large stack of paperwork that was donated by the 131st Infantry Regiment Association. They hadn't gone through it. They didn't know what was in there. So my internship that summer was going through, looking at it, see what was in there, and at the end of the day, shelve it in the library. See the basic preservation and archival work on that end.
Yeah.
But that's still not where my interest in World War I was really peaked. So they have the Great War Encampment out there, which is it's just a small World War I, reenactment / living history display.
With like the trench.
Yeah, I remember when they built that.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. But anyhow, so when I reenacted World War I going back to 2011, I always did German. That was always like kind of my interest with World War I was the German side of things.
Yeah.
Over the course of the pandemic, so getting to the more recent times now, I don't want to say I lost my job, but I was unemployed for a year and a half because the place where I worked shut down temporarily.
The archives in St. Louis?
Yeah.
The military archives?
Yeah, it's the National Personnel Records Center.
Yeah.
So basically if you had somebody who's in the military, that's where the record's going to be. That's where you're going to want to do the research. And of course, I would do research for others. But anyhow, times got a little tough during the pandemic, and I ended up selling all of my World War I German stuff except for like my helmet and maybe a few other things, just because the helmet's so iconic. Like I had to keep it.
They're pretty cool.
They are. And I said, I don't really do World War I that much just because there's not as many events as World War II. And I needed money. And I was like, all right, well, here, I'm done with it. Then a few months later, like 2 months later, I got a job, got money again. And I went to a World War I display, reenactment / display at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, which I've been to Jefferson Barracks multiple times. And I got there and I was looking at there weren't that many people left because this was on Sunday. Most people had already packed up and left. But I was talking with the Doughboy reenactors, the guys doing World War I American.
Yep.
And I said...
The classic Doughboy outfit.
Yeah. And I said, even when I did German, I kind of always wanted to do Doughboy a little bit. Just, because of the museum and there's so many resources for it. And I left that day and I said... I've got money now. I said I was never going to do World War I again, and here we go. I'm going to start doing American Doughboy now. So that is where my current interest in World War I, specifically the American involvement in World War I, comes from. Just that background with the museum, and of course they were always very World War I heavy, and then just going to that one display piqued my interest in doing it again. And, I know I say reenactment, but really, I don't do any reenactment battles with these. It's mostly just, getting the uniform right, getting the kit right.
Basically, like revisiting history for people to see.
Yeah, basically setting up a display. Yeah. And of course, there's the camaraderie of hanging out with your friends too.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's that's really where my current interest in World War I came from. So
yeah, and I think it's so cool because like kind of like going back with like what I've always like my focus, like you said, is World War II. When it came to studying war, my dad was obsessed with it. I've been watching World War II documentaries since I was literally 3 years old, and seeing these massive German tank forces attacking Russian tank forces. I'm like at 3 years old, like mind blown, like this actually happened.
And then you watch the History Channel and you learn about UFOs.
Yeah, that's today. But it's funny though because like I asked my dad, I'm like, well, there's World War II. Like when I got older, probably like 10, 12 years old, I'm like, well, there must have been a World War I. My dad's like, oh yeah, and I'm like, well, you have an obsession, my dad does, with World War II, like I started to have. And I'm like, well, tell me about it. Goes, oh, just trench fighting and boring guys, just kind of sat in trenches and shot each other. And I'm like, what? That's like, World War II, you got planes, naval battles, desert battles, city combat, massive destruction, nuclear bombs, all the above could happen. In World War I, all there is people sitting in trenches. What? And then when you go on to school, that's kind of like I started to learn about like, oh, they just sat on France and just kind of fought a little bit back and forth. There's no major battles or conflicts. And then the U.S. gets involved kind of late and kind of saves the day. People say yes or no, do we really make that big of a turning point in the war? But anyway, and then to come to find out just from a little bit of reading from the research you've already done, which we'll get into, it seems like World War I wasn't just this trench fighting.
Right. And especially, and of course, we can get into this more later, but especially the time that American forces got involved in any large significant or had any large significant impact, the war itself was really mobile by that point.
Yeah.
Of course, 1914, these European countries go to war with modern weaponry, and that's when they dig in. But by the time American forces got involved, I mean, of course, there was still...
What year? 1916?
1917.
I couldn't remember. I know it was like 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah, it was April 1917, but American forces really didn't... I think there were troops there by late 1917, but... I
know the Air Force contributed a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
possibly.
I will correct you there. It's the Army Air Service in World War I.
See, this is my knowledge again of the First World War.
Well, that's
very limited.
Well, that's why they say 1947 is the year that the Air Force divorced the Army, because prior to that, the Air Force was part of the Army.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I want to say it's like early 1918 is really when American troops start seeing combat. And of course, they're green, they're new, so they're mostly attached to like the French, the British. As the war continued through 1918, I mean, it definitely becomes very much not as stagnant as it was between 1914 to 1917.
Yeah, so let's dig in and start actually talking about what you found in these papers at the Illinois Military Museum. Yeah. And let's dig into the research that you found about the 129th Infantry Regiment. Yeah,
so I guess any talk about any unit specific or any discussion of any unit like we'll be doing definitely needs a little bit of background information.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I really find World War I history to be fascinating is because it was really the creation of America's modern military.
Yeah. So, I 100% agree with that.
So what I mean by that is you have the creation of these divisions. So, the 1st Division, the 2nd, and this goes up into the 10s and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So the unit I focus on is the 33rd Division, which was formed from Illinois National Guard units after we entered the war in 1917. So essentially, An infantry division consists, in World War I at least, consisted of 4 infantry regiments, several field artillery regiments. There was a sanitary train. There were machine gun battalions. There was an engineer regiment. So, you have all these units combined so that this division can, obviously operate functionally and be combat effective.
Yeah.
Now, of course, for reenacting, as far as what's affordable, doing anything other than infantry is like impossible. If you want to do artillery, well, you got to have a cannon.
Yeah.
If you want to do a machine gun battalion, you got to buy a machine gun. So,
and these are not like a portable machine gun; it's like a sit down.
Yeah. No.
Am I correct? Yeah.
This is an actual, basically tribal mounted machine gun.
Yeah, it's not like a little handheld machine gun like a Thompson or something like in World War II.
Yeah, it's water pretty
water
much
cooling.
Yeah. It's got a water jacket on the front. It's heavy, and then again, for the purposes of reenacting, other than just it's not like Call of Duty where just one person can operate a machine gun. Like, you got to have the assistant gunner, you got to have the ammunition bearers, you got to have the guys carrying the water to cool it down.
Exactly.
So as far as what's practical, most reenactors, focus on infantry
because you just have a rifle.
It's easiest to really portray. Now, it would be cool to do some of that other stuff, but I'm not rich, so I don't have the money to go out and buy a field cannon.
What?
Yeah, sorry. Maybe one of these days, we'll see.
If you do, please call me.
No, I will. One of these days, if I win the lottery. So, but to get back to what I was saying, most of this discussion is going to focus on the infantry because that's what I focus on. Yep. And so the infantry regiments in the 33rd were the 129th, the 130th, the 131st, and the 132nd.
All from Illinois.
Yes, they were formed from Illinois state regiments.
National Guard.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, if I'm not mistaken, the 129th, I believe, was the it was the 3rd and 7th Illinois infantry regiments, I believe. And actually, because I'm crazy about this, I need to actually look that up to confirm. I'm still,
you're still currently researching.
Right. Yeah. I know I've seen it several times. I know at least the 3rd Illinois Infantry Regiment was part of the 129th.
Yeah.
But essentially, so these units were formed into, you would have 2 state infantry regiments that were formed into, the 129th or the 130th, so on and so forth. And how I got to the 129th specifically to focus on, so when I was trying to decide which unit I wanted to portray for this, I originally wanted to do the 131st because the museum, most of their materials that they have, because most of it was donated from the Regimental Association, they have so much on the 131st, and that's what I was thinking of focusing on. Additionally, World War I is the only war in which the 131st actually saw combat operations in. They existed during World War II, but they never went overseas. And of course, I don't know much about the modern military organization of the Illinois National Guard, but there's some unit that exists from that lineage.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know that.
So that's why I was thinking of doing the 131st, and then I was like, well, they were based out of Chicago, and when you live south of Chicago, everything is about Chicago, and you're just tired of hearing about Chicago. Yeah, it's like I wanted to focus on something that was not just Chicago. I wanted to do something more local.
And like I said earlier, that's kind of when we talk about Illinois. Most people associate Illinois with Chicago. We get sick of that. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of Chicago, and I don't like the Cubs.
Hey man,
I'm drinking out of a Cardinals.
I live 15 minutes from St. Louis, and I'm still a Cubs fan. So.
And I'm a Cardinals fan. How does that work?
Good for you, man.
But anyway, so you didn't want to do that, so then you decided on the 129th.
So I originally didn't want to do the 129th, actually.
Really?
Because going back to World War II, as you know, I'm very big into my
World War II.
Well, I'm very big into the history of my great uncle, who's in the Pacific.
Yes.
He served with the 145th Infantry Regiment of the 37th Division, which was Ohio based.
Okay.
Now, during World War II, it wasn't as practical to keep National Guard divisions from one state, so that's why my great uncle from Central Illinois got put with this Ohio unit. But anyhow,
That's interesting.
Yeah, it gets kind of confusing really quick. But as I was saying, I already have I already have an interest in the 129th in World War II because they were part of the 37th Division during World War II. So I was like, well, I already like the 129th in World War II. I kind of want to do something different for World War I. And then I ran across something online that made me want to do the 129th in World War I.
So what was that?
When I was deciding on which unit I wanted to pick, I just did a random Google search at work one day on my lunch because I work in downtown St. Louis, like right across from the Arch. When the weather was still nice, I'd go up on the roof and just take in the sights.
Yep.
And I just got on my phone. I was looking like 33rd Division, Madison County, or whatever, because I'm from Madison County now.
Yeah.
And I ran across a random grave of there was an article from the Illinois World War I Centennial Commission from a few years ago during the 100th anniversary so they wrote this article about the soldier who was from Edwardsville who was killed, and he's got this grave that is a statue of the soldier.
Really?
And on it is engraved, it says Henry Ostendorf, Company M, 33rd Division, and then whatever his birth date and death date was. Yeah. And I said, well, I can tell just from looking at that there's an error. It should be Company M of whatever regiment, as part of the 33rd Division. Yeah. So I hopped on Ancestry, and Ancestry has the World War I passenger list digitized. Basically what the passenger lists are, whenever a ship left the U.S. or was coming back to the U.S., there was a roster of all personnel that were on it. And I found that Ostendorf was with Company M of the 129th. And that, I kind of looked at that, I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Then I started looking at that roster a lot more closely, and I found about 25% of that company was actually from Southern Illinois, guys who were in, there was one guy in Collinsville, there were guys in O'Fallon, Belleville, Edwardsville, Granite City, East St. Louis, Mascoutah, Lebanon, and even going further south out of the Metro East area. Yeah. Which was kind of unique because, again, going back to, these state regiments, they were all formed out of geographic areas. So in the case of Company M, they were headquartered out of Boone County, which is up by Rockford. Yeah. And so...
Not far from Chicago.
Well, it's still far enough, but the northern part of the state. And
I know.
It should go without saying that these regiments pretty much all came from Northern Illinois. They just weren't all Chicago like the 131st was. Yeah. So it goes without saying most of the men in the unit were from Boone County or Northern Illinois. Yes, there were several from Chicago as well.
There's some from Iowa too, right?
A handful. That's interesting. I'm still kind of trying to find more information on that. There were absolutely 100%. The vast majority of the men in this unit and most of the units in the 33rd were from Illinois, but there were guys. There were some from Wisconsin. Yeah. I saw that. A handful from Iowa.
Kind of interesting on that.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure how they got put in with them, but they did. But at any rate, so that's where my interest in Company M comes from, because a lot of the other companies I was looking at didn't really have as much of a significant number of Southern Illinois guys with them. So again, to kind of tie it all back home, wanting that interest with that local history. That's how I ended up landing on Company M specifically. So
pretty cool. Yeah. So then, what's your main focus with doing all this research on the company then? So, what do you want to do with it, or what? That's just for fun? Do you do reenacting? What is the...
A little bit of both. So from the reenacting perspective, this is the unit that I'm focusing on, is Company M of the 129th. And really, I think, a lot of actual professional historians don't exactly look on reenacting in the best light, because for the majority of reenactors, they don't have a history degree. For them, it's just an interest. It's a hobby.
They like the guns, the equipment, the fighting, the pretend, fighting, which is pretty cool when you're actually there.
Right.
When you actually witness it, it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
It's loud. It sounds like the real deal.
It's very loud.
Yeah.
But so to kind of go back to what I was saying, having a background in history, having been infatuated with it my whole life, having a degree in history, I really, to me, reenacting isn't just dressing up. It's like you're actually, you're wearing the uniform of people who lived at one point.
Yes.
These people have a story. And, I want to learn as much about those individuals as possible. Yeah. And that's why I focus on, this one unit. Because I not only portray them, but I want to know the history of, who they were, where they come from, what they do.
Well, going off that, tell me any personal stories that really you like from some of these men in this division.
Well, that's still some ongoing research, obviously. And, research is never really finished. Part of the problem with researching this period in history, obviously, is there's nobody alive.
Yeah,
so
unfortunately.
Unlike World War II.
There's still people.
Well, like when I was researching my great-uncle's unit, sure, there may only be 2 guys left now, but at least I got to talk to them. At least I got to hear their stories. With World War I,
most of these people died probably, 20, 30 years? That's, really pushing it.
Yeah.
90s, 80s, probably?
I think the latest one that I've found so far that died was in 92.
That's what I'm saying.
Most of them died
70s, 80s,
50s, some even in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, that's true.
So you're talking people who've been gone for a long time now.
Yeah.
And of course, it's been so long that even any family members that knew them, first of all, they probably didn't talk about it to begin with. But second of all, if they did, they probably don't remember much. So personal story wise, I've been limited to newspapers, as well as just what I can find online because, the National Archives just reopened. And of course I haven't had a chance to go there yet. And they have not yet fully reopened either. So it's still somewhat restrictive. But some of the personal stories I found, just look at this roster that I've created. There's several guys who weren't even born in America. There's several who were born in Italy. There was a set of brothers that were born in England. I'm trying to think, a lot of them died of disease, or not a lot, but several of them died from disease. I found several who, after the war, ended up getting placed in the Home for Disabled Veterans. So there's a lot of little interesting things that I don't know the full story, but there's definitely something there. I think maybe one of the more interesting stories I can tell just from the metadata that I've gathered so far is there was one veteran, Alfred Price. So he was born in 1886. So he was in his early 30s, I believe, when he went in the Army. And he ended up being awarded 2 Silver Stars and a Purple Heart Medal.
Yeah.
And this guy's in his 30s. There was another one I found. He was born in the 1870s. He's most likely a Spanish-American War veteran. So there's little things like that.
Yeah, when going off, because Matt has put together a pretty impressive array of newspaper articles, books written about this, maps, actual handwritten accounts, which we'll get into how you found all that, let alone. Yeah. I was just reading, because he previously told me before we even did this, about how some of the newspapers would actually put in some stories about how these soldiers or men died and fought. And I kind of clicked on a couple just to read. And this Ralph Selleck, this guy literally gets his face blown off by German shell at the Battle of like
Muse Argonne.
Yeah, Muse Argonne, like fighting like on the riverside. And I have it pulled up, and it's just like
I've got them pulled up here now.
Yeah, and it's just like, oh my god, like it literally says, was killed by a whiz-bang shell which made a direct hit in the face, passed on, struck a tree, and exploded. A splinter flying back, driving through. Lost my place.
It's kind of
the boy's right side and lung.
Yeah.
It was a splinter through the lung that killed him, and the wound in the face was a terrible one. Like that, reading that alone.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my god! Like these guys obviously went through some heavy.
Yeah.
Fighting.
Yeah, that's. I'm still doing the newspaper's research. These articles I've gathered right here. I got these very early on in my research of Company M. My goal with the newspapers is to, once I'm actually finished creating the roster and going through and finding, the basic information, when were they born, when did they die, what awards did they get, what rank did they achieve, do I have a picture of them, do I have a picture of their grave, that's what I'm doing at the moment. But after that, then I'm going to go through and search each individual of, over 200 guys.
Which is a lot.
Looking for individual newspaper articles. And as you can imagine, with more common names like guys named Smith, it's going to be harder to find some for those, but a lot
of these, the worst.
Yeah.
And that's what's kind of neat about this, like Ralph Selleck. That's a very unique. That's like, that guy right there would probably be pretty easier research, like you said, versus Smith or Johnson.
Yeah.
Like Johnson's such a common last name. It's like, my God, even my own historical research, when you see a common name, you just want to oh my God.
Barf.
You just like, well, I'm screwed.
Yeah, I'm never finding that guy. So I guess as far as the newspapers are concerned, one of the more interesting stories I can kind of talk about here is a guy by the name of Paul Garrica. He lived up in Marengo, again, up by Chicago. It's McHenry County. And there's a whole article on how he died and also how the company captain, Andrew Davis, was also killed. So Davis, from what I've found so far, was the only captain in the regiment who was killed.
Wow.
And Garrica, so he was shot, Davis was shot through the heart, and then Garrica went to go to his aid and took a direct hit in the back from a German Minenwerfer round, which is it's mortar round.
Wow.
Which is that quote unquote whiz bang that was mentioned in that other article.
Okay.
But interestingly, Garrica had a buddy who was named Carl Shattuck, who wrote several letters home, and these letters were all published in the paper in Belvedere, which is the seat of Boone County, where the county that the company came from. And he talked about how Garrica died, but he also, what I found to be really, I guess, kind of touching, you could say, is that in 1920, he actually put a memorial notice in the paper for him. He said, let me find it here. Yeah, so he says, in memoriam, in memory of Private Paul Garrica, Company M1 29th Infantry, who died for his country in the Argonne Forest, France on October 11th, 1918, by his pal and comrade Carl Shattuck, Company M1 29th Infantry. So, and that's after the war. So, even just that little snip, I guess you could say, just kind of shows you, even though the war was over, it's still
pretty recent.
Yeah, it was still
2 years later.
Yeah, it was still with them.
Yeah.
And there's actually, I have to wonder if Shattuck actually wrote a memoir at some point, because he wrote a lot for the paper.
And when the Battle of Argonne Forest is one of the brutal battles of World War I.
Yeah, it was.
Do you know a little bit about? Can you tell us a little bit about that battle, Matt?
I mean, the Meuse Argonne offensive was giant and involved pretty much every unit in the army. So talking about
Was it U.S. Army?
Yeah, well, I mean, it involved, it wasn't just the U.S. Army, but it was, in terms of military history, a lot of people, like to think, oh, well, D-Day, Iwo Jima, Khe Sanh, Desert Storm, whatever. The Use-Our-Ground Offensive was actually the largest operation in American military history.
Really?
Yeah.
Over D-Day?
Yeah. I mean, D-Day was the largest seaborne invasion, but as far as the largest American operation, period, Use-Our-Ground Offensive.
How many Americans did this involve? Can you remember an idea off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I don't. Wow. I mean, but you're talking pretty much very much so the majority of the American Army was involved in some form or another in this offensive.
So then what was the point? So where was the offensive, like, what was the goal to take over the
I mean, basically just to push into Germany and
push them out
and crack their backs, so to speak. I mean, by the end of it, obviously by November, the Germans were like, well, it's time. It's been 4 years. It's time now.
Yeah, and obviously they won the battle. The Allies won the battle of Argonne Force, whatever you want to call it. The 33rd Division did help out, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it was one of several American divisions that were involved. Because, like I said, pretty much every American infantry division was involved in this. And so, I mean, the 33rd definitely played a part. The one company M battle I can kind of talk about was in, it was like a week period in early October. I believe it was like October 8th through the 16th, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, to my knowledge, the entire, or all the regiments in the division were gassed at some point. And,
really?
Yeah. And
what type of gas?
Phosgene, mustard.
Yeah.
Just to name a few. There's actually, I haven't read through the whole thing yet, but there's actually a U.S. military study from I want to say the 50s or the 60s, that actually looked at the 33rd Division being gassed in this one period. Mm-hmm. And it's got some interesting little tidbits in it, like the 129th was the most gassed. But interestingly, there existed no report from the regimental chemical officer compared to the other regiments. However, so one of the stories that I find really interesting in one of these newspaper articles is it talks about a guy who was it was him and a buddy. They were hit by a mustard gas round, and the shrapnel from the round like incapacitated one of them, and the other one is like trying to put his mask on him while he himself is breathing the stuff in.
I have to take a drink on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think,
wow.
I think poison.
And so, just before we get any more, so just in that typical little instance, this guy's breathing this in, he's probably can't see, he's coughing, probably vomiting, maybe possibly even bleeding. This is like dangerous shit, you know?
And he's like, before he even does anything with his mask, he's trying to get his buddies on him because he's incapacitated. He ended up dying anyway.
From the gas? Or?
The one who was incapacitated died.
Wow.
I've got so many news articles here, I haven't, I'm not sure which one it's in. But yeah, the other one lived, but actually it might have been, I think his name was James Court, may have wrote about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing with these articles is they oftentimes mention multiple different individuals. So in the file name, when I catalog it, I put all of their names in there. So, but yeah, it's just, I think poison gas is really, if people don't know much about World War I, that's like the one thing that they do know, because it was just such a horrific weapon. And of course, it's been banned by international law afterwards.
And now,
doesn't mean it hasn't been used since then, but
and now we even look at today, with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, now they're starting to say Russia is possibly going to start using these type of chemical warfare. Again, that was banned at the Geneva conference of rules of war. And because, like, this little instance we talk about, it's just so brutal. And I could not even imagine
and
trying to save get a mask on your buddy and suffering. I mean,
and I was going to say mustard gas in particular. I mean, of course, poison gas is nasty as is, but in terms of, at least with gas masks, the gas mask would, filter the air through it, make it breathable.
Yeah.
Whereas with mustard gas, it didn't just attack your lungs; it would also burn your skin.
Oh my God! I was about to say, how effective were these gas masks back then? Did they actually really work?
They did. The problem is, in that military study that I told you about, that looks at the gas with the 33rd Division in this particular instance in October of 1918, actually delved into something you wouldn't really think about called gas mask exhaustion. So the World War I the gas masks that were used by the Americans and the British. The British developed the smallpox respirator, and the Americans initially used those, but they also developed what they called the corrected English model gas mask, which is basically the same mask with some minor changes to it. The mask basically, you not only had to put this piece of rubberized cloth on your face, it also had a mouthpiece that you had to stick in your mouth that would go through the hose and down into the respirator box.
Okay.
And then you also had a nose clip that would pinch your nose shut.
Really?
So if you can imagine, as the 33rd was here, being consistently gassed, and you're wearing this thing for hours on end, and you can't breathe out of your nose, you're just breathing through a mouthpiece. I mean, you can only imagine like how terrible that must have been to do that. And
you can't even see either very well out of those things.
Right. Yeah. No. It's,
let alone were the Germans? Do you know, were they like assaulting or pushing, or do they usually just gas and then just kind of let the gas do the damage? I mean,
little bit of both. Of course, this article I mentioned mostly just talks about the effects of the gas on the division. I don't think it really goes much into
the details.
Yeah, the actual. I mean, it gives. What's interesting about this article is it actually gives like the German plans.
Really?
Like it uses German documentation of like what shells they used, what types of gas they used, how many they shot. It's pretty detailed as far as like the use of chemical warfare.
Who used it more? Was it the Germans? Did you think the Americans and the Brits used it as much?
I mean, I can't really say one way or another who used as much. Gas itself was really had to be used in the right conditions. Mostly, which I mean wind. Obviously, if the wind is blowing to your lines, you're not going to shoot gas because it's going to come back to you. And at least early on in the war, gas, before it was used in artillery shells, which is what it ultimately ended up getting used in, they would basically just have tubes out there that would, unleash the gas. And
kind of like a border.
Just kind of have to hope that the wind doesn't blow back at you.
That'd be that alone would be scary. Even thinking you're unleashing this toxin and it could possibly come back on you on top.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing too, and you think about it, even after a while that gas goes away, I mean, you got to admit that stuff's probably still in the air a little bit.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, that stuff lingers on clothes, like you said, it burns your skin.
Yeah,
that shit's going to be everywhere. So even when you do attack the enemy,
that's one of the things with gas is, especially in like areas of low density, like it would just sit there,
like in trench.
Yeah,
in a trench.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was just an absolutely nasty weapon, and like I said, with the gas mask, the German mask was a bit different. So basically, as I was saying with the U.S. mask, like you have this mask that you put on your face, but you've also got this basically box sitting on your chest that holds the respirator itself, I'm struggling to come up with the name of it, but anyhow, it sits on your chest, and that's how it works.
So this thing just filter like
they had a charcoal filter that would, yeah.
I bet that wasn't even good breathing that in either.
And here's the thing: is I don't know if they did this in World War One. I think the World War One mask mostly just used charcoal, but World War II they started using asbestos filters. So,
what?
Yeah. Which at the time,
oh my god!
At the time, I could be completely wrong. I don't think at the time it was necessarily dangerous, but especially now after talk about World War II, like 80 years, like that is degraded. And if you put on a World War II mask, you're gonna basically get mesothelioma if you do it for any prolonged period of time.
Wow.
But
learn something new.
Right. But the German masks originally were made out of a rubberized canvas. They later ended up using dog skin on the 1917 model mask.
I kind of remember that now.
Specifically because dogs don't sweat, so the pores are tighter.
Wow.
Which means less likely to get through to the face.
So they skin dogs, basically?
Well, I mean, I don't know the particulars of...
That's kind of messed up.
I would imagine that they didn't just go around knocking on doors, like stealing people's dogs. I mean, it was probably, stray animals. Or I mean, it sucks to think about anyway. But
let's move on. Let's not get into that discussion. Like, I'm an animal lover, so...
I am too.
Yeah, so let's move down on that one. But that story alone just amazes me.
Yeah, and I've got it pulled up now. I think it's about probably 80 pages or so where it talks about the 33rd Division's experience with gas along the Meuse River in October 1918. But yeah, it's I'm not sure if it says it in here or not, but I remember at one point several years ago I heard that the 33rd was like the most gassed division out of every unit in the American Expeditionary Forces. So they definitely, saw their fair share of poison gas exposure in World War I. And one of the men of Company M, as I recently found, ended up dying in 1929 from it.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah. What are the long-term effects of this?
I mean, it just kind of depends on what happened to the individual.
Yeah.
In this man's case, I remember his obituary said he was gassed in, during World War I and has been in poor health ever since. And yeah, he died at a veterans hospital in Kansas City, and I want to say it was 1929. I'm looking. I know you were asking a little bit about the number of shells fired on the 33rd.
Yeah.
In terms of gas, and so when I'm looking, this table I've got pulled up here says on October 13th the Germans fired 13,099 high explosive shells and 1,117 gas shells. The next day was 3,000 almost 4,000 high explosive shells and almost 4,000 gas shells. So, and this goes on for several days. So, I mean, you can only imagine, how much these guys were being exposed to gas, throughout this whole period. And it looks like, so it actually has the daily gas casualties for the 33rd. For all the regiments, it shows the...
That's my next question.
Yeah,
How many people, you fired that much artillery and gas and shells, what are the casualty rates of this?
So it's showing the 129th from October 4th through October 21st had a total of 1,014 gas casualties.
Wow.
Of that, 996 went to the field hospital.
Wow.
So, some of these men weren't even treated. And there was also, it actually mentions a little bit of the tactical situation in here where, there were men who claimed to be gas casualties when they really weren't, just because it was so terrible. I mean,
terrifying.
Yeah.
Alone terrible, you know?
And then the division in general, it says of the 1,978 total gas casualties, the 1,294 admitted as a result of unidentified gas, mixed gas, or gas not yet determined, support the Field Hospital statement that 60% of the men tagged quote-unquote gas were suffering from causes other than gas. The principal other cause was unquestionably gas mask exhaustion, which, like I was telling you, due to the design of the mask, mouthpiece, and the nose clip, making it difficult to use for any extended period of time. So yeah, I mean, this report really is unique. I haven't found one yet on any other divisions.
Wow.
But it's just, it really gives you really a more personal view
of what these guys went through.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, would you know, like what would they do if you were gassed at the field hospital? Fan you out, get some fresh air, and get water? I mean, what do you do?
I honestly, I would have to look up medical reports for that. I don't.
I'm just kind of.
I couldn't personally tell you, what they would do to men who were gassed. But obviously, in the case of that one guy who died in 1929, they couldn't do anything for him. Like,
just get him in some fresh air away from the front, I guess, is like the best thing, because that would have been horrific to have that many things fired, that many shells, and constantly firing at you.
And then it's also showing the weekly gas figures from the 3rd Corps. So divisions that were in the 3rd Corps were the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, 32nd, 33rd, 80th, and 90th.
Okay, so multiple.
Yeah. The 33rd sustained 1,716 men gassed. The 80th, 1,462, which makes sense because they were in the area of the 33rd.
Mm-hmm.
Fought alongside them. And then just to give you a perspective of what other units endured, the 32nd Division had 15 gas casualties.
Wow.
The next highest was the 4th with 918.
Okay.
So
basically, the German army took out about a little over 3,000, maybe about 4,000 casualties.
I mean, all these all said and done, it shows all the divisions combined suffered 5,727.
So I was a little off. But pretty close.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty. And so these and the American forces are attacking the German lines during all this?
Yeah.
They're making a push, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it was...
So was this trench warfare, urban warfare? What was this type of...
Definitely trench, open area warfare.
So they're crossing no man's land, like the traditional... Well... Because it says in some of these stories they're near the river Meuse, so they're...
Yeah, so...
Was there like...
I mean, there were obviously defensive trenches, but this was not like the Somme or Verdun in 1916 and Passchendaele in 1917,
where people are running across an open field just getting
where you have both of these sides who have been digged in for years. I mean, this is pushing, further into. I mean, not Germany. This is France and Belgium.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean. This, like I was saying, this was not traditional trench warfare. This was literally like actual huge open fields with obviously trees and hills and berms and stuff.
Yeah.
But
it wasn't your traditional.
It was not what you would consider trench warfare from what most people think of as trench warfare.
Yeah.
At least in my mind. Of course, I know everybody thinks of things differently.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the, and as far as reenacting is concerned, this is the one battle I try to, or I'm looking at focusing on. Again, I've been doing so much with trying to collect metadata, and I work, and of course it's kind of hard to find the time to, dig into all of this in depth when you're trying to focusing on one other thing.
It's very difficult.
Time management.
Yeah, because like even with this podcast and with researching history, I have a full-time job, a very intense job. It's some days after work you want to do research. Like I get excited about doing these things, and then it's
but then sometimes you just want to play games.
Exactly.
I want to play Xbox.
Yeah.
Halo, hell let loose.
Yeah. Play a video game. Let your mind free. And take it easy.
Yeah.
But these stories, like just hearing this, like this is truly amazing because I didn't even know this was the largest U.S. invasion. Or not invasion, but attack.
Military operation.
Military operation, sorry. And that's just crazy. And these guys are fighting kind of in a more, not your traditional way. They're charging in an open field, getting shelled constantly.
Right.
They push, what do they end up pushing back the Germans? They are successful.
Yeah.
The 33rd Division is?
Yeah, ultimately.
Which is pretty cool. I mean, do they get in basically hand-to-hand combat, or do they push the Germans out? If you not know, if you've not gotten that far yet?
I haven't gotten that far yet. Because again, just going back to what I like with history, I like reading more of like the little man story.
Yeah.
And then again, the scarcity of first person accounts. At least, I've found multiple first person accounts from the 33rd Division, but I mean specifically for this unit, the most in depth that I have so far are the newspapers.
Yeah.
I have actually been in contact with the Boone County Museum of History. They actually have quite a lot on Company M. Of course, it's 5 hours away, so I can't.
Where's that located?
Belvedere. But anyhow,
is it a big museum? Small?
It's a smaller museum from what I know.
Huh.
But
that's pretty neat. I didn't know that.
While the National Archives has been closed,
due to COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah, that's where I did a lot of research, and then of course the pandemic hits, and
so this in St. Louis they would have all these details or more.
Well, that's the thing is with smaller local museums like the Boone County Museum, for example, they're more apt to have more personal
stories,
materials, I guess you could say,
versus like unit and the other.
Yeah, well, the National Archives in St. Louis, the main thing that I would want to find for this unit would be the burial case files. So veterans who were killed, they had a whole record done up on their death and final burial. Sometimes you'll even find one of their dog tags in there.
Really? Oh yeah, you've showed me before. Bloody. You actually saw one with like actual blood stains on it. Correct?
From World War II. Yeah, I once got a dog tag from a guy in. I want to say he was in the tank destroyer battalion, but his tank got hit, and it was his dog tag. I mean, you could tell he burned to death. I mean, he was charred, and you could tell where the graves registration, the men who would go through and identify and bury the bodies.
Wow. It's very, very
where they tried to like scrap, try and get some of the scrape some of the black off the dog tag so they could actually read it. Like
wow.
Now, you don't find those as often for World War II. World War I is a bit of a different story. Pretty much most of the burial files I've got for World War I typically have, the dog tag in there. So the dog tags were...
Are they usually in good condition, or...?
Yeah, for being untouched in 100 years.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the cool thing about them. I mean, obviously it's sad. I mean...
Are they the traditional... dog tags like you're used to,
So the dog tags in World War I were little round discs that would have the name and serial number, sometimes the unit and rank, stamped on there.
Well, they wear it around their neck we're traditionally.
And then
when the soldier would fall, they would pull it off, or how would that?
So a lot of people get their dog tag history from Saving Private Ryan. They think when guys died, you just take the dog, the commanding officer would take the dog tags off the body and carry it around with them, and that's total BS. The whole point of the dog tags were to identify the body.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then after, during the final burial, when they were buried in a initially temporary cemetery, and they put the cross up, they would nail one of the dog tags to the cross to identify the body, and then there would be the other dog tag would be buried with the body, so that when they disinterred it for permanent burial,
they would know.
Yeah. So
which one's in the archive? The one on the body?
I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't. I have to imagine it's probably the one
on the body.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would imagine that once they, came up with the final grave marker, they just tossed that one.
Yeah, because you would see like the nail through it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it had a hole in it already
to
be worn around the neck.
That's true. That's true.
But anyhow, so as far as the National Archives in St. Louis is concerned, that's mostly what I'd want to find there. Sometimes those burial files even have relatively personal stories in them. There was one I got for a friend's relative. I think he was 26th Division. I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyhow, he was in an artillery unit. He wasn't even killed at the front line. They were like pulling the gun with a horse, and an artillery shell came in and hit him, basically smashed him.
Wow.
And there was a typed up account in this record from a buddy of his attesting to how he died. Like, now that's not present in all of them, but you don't know until you look. So that's part of the reason why I want to get these records.
That's crazy. That's and that's just, I couldn't even imagine, like, and that's the fun part about digging into history, which you don't learn in a traditional classroom. You open a book, you hear about, World War I, you hear about Duke Ferdinand assassinated, and then trench warfare, and people got gassed. Yeah. You don't get to hear or see, like you said, it would be a cool field trip to take a class of kids down, open up a couple archives, see a dog tag that's got charred on it. I know it's a little horrific for children.
Right.
Okay, maybe high school kids.
right.
You know what I mean? Let's not say children. Say high schoolers. I bet you that if I was 15 and saw that, it would humble you. You'd feel more respect for your veterans, and on top of that, it piques I would say it would pique a lot of people's interest in history, that it's not this boring event in time. And when you have to see, actually pull up a personal account of someone being blown to pieces by an artillery shell.
Right. And that's, to kind of get into so it should go without saying that as far as personal stories go, researching veterans who were killed typically have more information.
Yeah.
Because other people wrote about them. Families wanted to know what happened. One of the more interesting things that I've run across in just researching the 33rd, fortunately, all of the unit histories that existed or that do exist, they were all published mostly in 1919, 1920, throughout the 1920s.
Yeah.
The copyrights all expired.
I saw that on the Google.
Yeah, so most of them are now, I
saw that on the Google copyright.
Right.
On one of the books. Go on. Sorry.
So a lot of these unit histories are digitized. And as much as I love digging through an archive, looking at stuff that, hasn't been touched in years, as far as veterans who were killed goes, probably the most craziest thing I've ever seen in a unit history is the unit history for the 131st Infantry Regiment. Towards the end of it, for pages upon pages, has a personal account of every single veteran who was killed from that regiment. So guys who served who were next to them, saw them get killed, they actually write down in detail what happened. So I can try and pull one up. I remember. Yeah,
pull one up for us.
Yeah,
I think that would be crazy. And
there's one of them. It even shows the picture. So this guy, he was killed at the Battle of Hamel. We can talk about that here in a second. But it's actually got a picture in the unit history of what they would often do is they would take German prisoners and use them for burial detail. And it's got these German prisoners with his body.
Really?
Yeah.
So they would basically capture these capture the German prisoners and say, "Hey, you're digging our dead graves."
Well, I mean, they would use them to pick up the dead and things like that.
That's crazy.
I mean, this unit history.
That's kind of neat. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't blame the Americans for doing that. I mean, they're
Well, it wasn't just us that did it. It was the French and the British.
Everyone that was kind of a common thing.
So I'm trying to. I mean, that's the thing with this unit history is it really is massive. I mean,
when
it says there's 800 pages.
Yeah, when Matt sent me all this on a Google Drive, there's probably 4 or 5 books that are like Matt said, 800 pages. I skimmed through multiple pages. There's tons and tons of photographs, which we'll talk about later. I want to know more detail about that.
Yeah.
There's like maps of battles and there's tons, and there's even Matt even found not alone pictures but actual footage, which I want to know about too a little bit. Which we'll get into that because I don't want to get our focus off what we're about to talk about here. So
so to get back to what I was saying, some of the more crazy things that I found in my research. So the 131st Infantry Regiment Association has a list not the association. I'm clowning right now. The regimental history has an entire section devoted to the men who were killed. And whereas with most unit histories, they list, it's just a list of names of the men who were killed. The 131st history, very much differently, actually has first-person accounts of how each person was killed or, died. I'm just looking through some of these.
This is the 131st Regiment?
Yeah, this is the one I was telling you about that was out of Chicago.
Yeah, so the 33rd Division is not a part of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to clarify for everyone that's listening.
So it says, it looks like here, Private Michael H. Dieterle, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. It says, information given by Joseph M. Butler, Sergeant Company H, said he was hit by a machine gun bullet through the head while out on patrol on the east bank of the Meuse River near Consavoy, France on October 9th, 1918. His last words were, "Oh my God."
Wow. So basically they were fighting along with the 33rd Division if he died near the Meuse River, right?
Yeah, the 131st was part of the 33rd.
Yeah. It was part of the 33rd.
Yeah. There's another one that says, information given by William N. Z, Corporal, Company H. I was with Sergeant Dorman at the time he was hit, September 26, 1918. It was in the swamp just behind the trenches where we started. His last words to me were, "Oh my God, Z, I'm hit. Take my maps and compass and carry on." He was hit in the hand with a piece of shrapnel from a large shell. There was another one I distinctly remember, of course. I can't remember the name of who it was, but basically the guy was hit in the head from an anti-aircraft shell. It gets pretty grisly in here, and this is the interesting thing, kind of going back to, what we were talking about with the newspapers and the details in them is, this is, we always talk about like censorship in American history, and this is, for 1918, this is some pretty heavy stuff that was being published. Especially for the newspapers, these were like the raw words, like letters being written home from the guys themselves, and then were being published in papers. And of course, this is like, this is the book, where they're putting this in. So,
and just to talk about it, it's just like kind of like World War II overshadows a lot of these stories. Like we were saying, we always picture World War II as being very gruesome, a lot of brutal fighting, and then you hear these about the First World War and these young men, especially for the United States, goes over and risks their lives, and hearing this from Illinois natives, it's kind of hard to believe that these men went through this, and hearing those last words from that guy saying, "Oh my God," that's just crazy. Like I'm sitting here trying to picture myself in that, and that's what I love about hearing these things is I like picture myself there.
Yeah.
And hearing that stuff really brings me into really being able to sit. I actually feel like I'm there a little bit hearing these things.
Right.
Not even seeing a picture or anything along those lines.
Yeah, no, and that's
your imagination kind of run wild.
Right. And that's one of the things with World War I is, there's really not a lot of actual like combat photographs or footage.
Like
because, both the cameras and the motion picture cameras,
it's still new, very new.
This was not like World War II where you
had handheld camera.
Yeah, there were box cameras that existed, but the actual signal corps photographs that were put out by the military, these were like tripod cameras.
Yeah.
So there's several, there's enough pictures to show what the landscape looked like what these, the environment that these guys were living in.
Yeah.
But, it's not like World War II where, the Battle of Okinawa, there's footage of a kamikaze hitting a ship.
Yeah. There's footage of actually men dying live.
Right.
Falling down in the midst of fighting. You see tanks shooting, flamethrowers out of them at Japanese, fortifications. You don't see, and I feel like that's the other problem when it comes to, talking about the First World War in documentaries.
People don't visualize it.
Yeah,
as much.
And in documentaries, like, oh, let's make a war documentary. Everyone goes to where there's lots of footage, easy to really show people. So that's why anything World War II till, today, that's what's usually the focus. World War One,
right?
No documentaries, or there's very few.
And that's what I really liked about They Shall Not Grow Old.
Me and you went and saw that in the theater.
We did. I told you after I saw it with my grandpa, I said, we need to go see this. I want to go see it again. I know you're going to like it. Let's go see it.
It was awesome.
And sure enough, you liked it. So,
but in that they had to put a lot of work into it. They had to make sound effects, all the above. Because they didn't have all that.
Right. Well, even in World War II, they're
added later.
There was no sound still. I mean, there was sound, but, most of the actual combat footage, there wasn't.
It's laid in. Yeah. It's added later.
It's just silent. However, what I really liked about that, probably my favorite part of that movie actually is the 30 minutes after where Peter Jackson talks about the making of it.
Yeah.
And he was talking about, of course, most footage is not in combat, but he said there is some. Some of the footage that they put in the movie actually showed trench raid on German lines, bringing back a prisoner. There's another piece in there that actually shows an artillery shell hitting a convoy of horses, and one of the horses is, it shows the aftermath. It's like horse is dead.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, of course, that's very, very rare for the time that you would find something like that. I agree with you as far as the footage goes, but yeah, that's really, what I like with, looking at all this documentation and the unit histories, and of course the pictures you find that go along with it.
Let's talk about.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a good transition.
Let's just talk about photos that you have found. How did you even find these?
So I've basically got what I consider to be two different types of pictures. I've got pictures of the individuals of Company M, which of course more often than not are studio portraits, postcards. Because, again, going back to what we were just saying with cameras back then, whereas, like, my great-uncle's World War II photo album has 50 pictures. There's pictures of them doing everything. World War I, it's very much taken in a studio more often than not. And those I've amassed from the Boone County Museum of History. Has a lot of pictures of individual Company M men. And then also just in my research on Ancestry, I found, people with family trees who have a picture of the veteran. One of them is actually really cool. It's a picture of him after the war in like 1918 or 1919. And then there's another picture of him from the 40s when he was in the, I'm pretty sure it's the American Legion, for Veterans of Foreign Wars. Wearing like his hat. He's obviously a little bit older now.
Yeah.
He's got his medals. He's wearing a Purple Heart. So it's kind of cool to, try and gather as many individual shots of these guys as you can. The other pictures that I have, which are the ones I'm definitely very, very much interested in, are all the Army Signal Corps photographs. So these are photographs that were taken by the Army Signal Corps, specifically for the purpose of distribution to the American public, keeping internally in the military. So for things like, what does a Browning automatic rifle look like disassembled? Or, here's Val Browning, John Browning's son in the 79th Division with BAR.
Yeah.
but then there's, I mean, there's just all, I mean, of course, that's just a very small example.
Yeah, you have guys like, looks like after a battle, kind of sitting down.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are guys, like maybe in battle or about to go into battle.
Yeah, there's at least one that I know of that was taken of guys like in the middle of the battle.
Yeah.
And of course, by in the middle of the battle, I mean the Germans are very far away.
Yeah. Like
I mean, you can see the Americans taking cover. You know where the German line's at, but it's far enough away that the cameraman could get a picture.
Yeah.
But yeah, so these are all available on the National Archives website.
Free to find.
Free to the public.
Wow.
Yeah, the National Archives catalog, you go on there. They've digitized, I don't want to say every single one, but definitely the vast majority from units are digitized. And I've also had to do a little bit of extra searching as well by keyword for other pictures. So, for example, the Battle of Hamel, which I know I've mentioned earlier, is quite interesting in terms of the 33rd's participation in World War I. They were the only American division in France to fight with the Australians, the British, and the French, and obviously the American Army as well. And the Battle of Hamel was the first action in which the division was involved in. And it wasn't even the division as a whole. It was only 4 companies, 2 from the 131st and 2 from the 132nd, who were attached to the Australians. An interesting thing about the Battle of Hamel is it was really the first combined arms military operation using tanks, planes, infantry, artillery, everything coordinated.
Wow.
Communicating as best as possible. Obviously, this is 1918. It's not like they have walkie-talkies they can use.
Yeah.
But the battle itself wasn't so significant as far as the grand scheme of the war was concerned, but as far as like military history is concerned, it's definitely significant in that way. But anyhow, to get back to the pictures and the Battle of Hamel, there was a picture that I found posted by an Army historian. It didn't have the National Archives, or not the National Archives. It didn't have the Signal Corps index number. A lot of them have it written on there with either a marker or a grease pen or whatever. And obviously, whenever you go to look it up on the National Archives website, you use that number to find it.
Yeah.
But it was a really cool picture, and it said Americans rest near Hamel. And I knew just from that caption that it was 33rd. And I looked up and down the National Archives catalog, could not find it. And I ended up running across a set of photographs, Records Group 165, which are quoted as unofficial American photographs of World War I.
Wow. And
started searching up by keyword. And the keyword for this particular photograph was Corby, which is a place literally right next to Hamel. Sure enough, I found that exact picture. So even though it doesn't say it's from the 33rd Division, I know it is just from the location and the fact that it mentions it says before going into battle with the Australians the next day in July of 1918.
And all the American soldiers.
Yeah.
They got the iconic doughboy uniforms on.
Yeah, and it's them. I mean, as far as a reenactor goes, it's a cool picture to geek out on, because this is July of 1918. They've obviously got British smallbox respirators, British Brodie helmets, which the helmets, you can't really tell the difference between a British and American helmet.
They look almost identical.
They're essentially the same thing. The only difference are the metal loops that hold the chin strap, and the texturing in the paint, which of course you can't see in a photograph.
Yeah. It's all black and white.
Yeah, and then the liner was slightly different. But I mean, that this early on, that's what they would have had, rather than an actual American-produced helmet. But anyhow, they've also got canvas leggings. So basically, it's a piece of canvas between the boot and the the trousers that kind of keeps dirt, dust, debris, so on and so forth out from getting in your boots. And the reason why that's interesting is because American soldiers were issued leggings when they went overseas, but after they got over there, more often than not, they wore they're known as patties. They're basically wool leg wraps.
Yeah.
They're a pain to put on. They look good, but they're a pain to put on. And of course, the 33rd, as with pretty much every American unit, wore those later. Going in later, even further later stages of the war. But then the most interesting thing about that picture is if you look really closely, you can see a lot of them are carrying Model 1917 trench knives, which is really nasty weapon. It's basically, it's got a wood handle that you hold on to, and then it's got a knuckle duster around it, to punch somebody and bash their face in, and then it's got a triangular blade, which creates a sucking wound, which is basically impossible to heal.
Yeah.
So, as far as a reenactor goes, those little details are really neat. And then I guess lastly, the fact that they're also carrying British short magazine Lee Enfields, the Enfield rifle, which was standard issue for the British and the Australians.
So the Americans didn't bring their own rifles with them?
Well, that's the interesting thing.
I did not know that.
They did. They went over with Model 1903 Springfields.
I was about to say, I thought the Springfield rifle was the...
Well, we could talk about that real quick. So specifically in the case of the 33rd, they, being a National Guard unit, they had Model 1903 Springfields when they went over.
Bolt-action rifles, correct? Yeah.
And then because they were attached to the Australians, were issued on, Enfield rifles. And then after they were reverted back to American control, they were reissued Springfield rifles.
Wow.
And it's, as far as the Springfield rifle goes, it's kind of interesting because I think everybody associates the Springfield as like the quote-unquote standard issue American rifle of World War I. It actually wasn't.
It wasn't?
No. The standard issue rifle was the Model 1917 Enfield, which is not the same as the rifle I was just talking about. The Model 1917 Enfield was basically a British pattern 14 Enfield rifle converted to American 30-06 ammunition.
Okay.
And that armed about 75% of the American Expeditionary Forces, whereas the other 25% were issued the Springfield rifle. Not necessarily sure why. We were just able to churn out more 1917s than we could Springfields. But yeah, as far as weaponry goes.
So my question to you then,
Okay.
which you as the reenactor, what one would you want to reenact with? The Enfield or the Springfield?
Well, I would like an Enfield because they're cheaper.
Yeah.
But I have to use a Springfield for this because that's what the 33rd got. I've got, I think, 3 pictures of 3 individuals using a 1917 Enfield and the 33rd. Everything else that I've seen is a 1903 Springfield. So for the purposes of reenacting, yes, I use a 1903.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Little nerd details for you there.
Well, I like to know that type of stuff. It's kind of neat. Interesting because, like you said, historians and reenacting, all these different things. It's very difficult because, just kind of going on this tangent for a minute, because historians, we like to have everything accurate. Like you said, a lot of reenactors will have mismatch items on their gear, uniform, weapons, whatever. The difference, between you from most reenactors, you take it very seriously.
Right.
You want it to get as accurate as possible. I know, like you said, it's almost sometimes difficult to do because very expensive trying to find these original items.
Well, and that's the thing with World War II reenacting. I definitely use a lot of original stuff because it's, first of all, we produce more of it. Second of all, it's just more readily available. World War I, I use original web gear, so like
Sorry about that.
You're good.
My phone notification went off on my computer for some reason.
But like the web gear that I use, cartridge belt, first aid pouch, my pack, my canteen, that's all original because that stuff is still relatively easy to find. It's still relatively affordable. But when it comes to uniforms, original pants, original jacket, um, you're talking about 100-year-old clothing, textiles. That's, when you're wearing it is probably not going to last. But I'll tell you what, one of my buddies that I reenact with, the guy is built just like somebody from 1918. He's a twig. Like, he's skinny.
Yeah.
He can find an original jacket or trousers that fits him for cheap.
Yeah. Because most people back then too were smaller.
Oh, yeah.
You have to think, today we eat 10 times more food than people did back in 1917 and 18.
Right.
we eat very bad. And Matt's not a big guy,
No. I mean,
at all. I'm bigger than you.
Right. And I could easily find an original uniform that would fit me. It's just a matter of, I'm going to spend $250 for this uniform, and then maybe the first time I put it on, the sleeve rips off or whatever,
And you spend all that money, you don't want it to get tore up either.
Right. But yeah, and then kind of the nice thing with World War I as far as uniforms are concerned is, unlike World War II, there was really only one primary uniform that they wore in World War I, which was the wool service coat, wool breeches, and then a wool undershirt. And of course, they had fatigues and things like that. But as far as like an actual what they would wear in combat, pretty much the same thing. Whereas with World War II, it's like, well, they could have worn, the regular wool shirt and pants, and then they could have worn the fatigues, and then they could have worn one of two different style field jackets, or maybe they wore this tanker jacket, So it's more complicated, I guess you could say, to piece together. But anyhow, so yeah, that's just me geeking out on the details. And that's, the pictures are where I really started at to begin with. Part of doing the research is getting the uniform and everything right. And of course, what better source to go to than the actual pictures of the guys you're dressing up as. So.
And the cool thing too is, it's kind of hard to visualize this over a podcast.
Right.
That's why, like on my Instagram page, hopefully Matt will be giving me a couple of images so you can show everyone to look at, and possibly I'd like to post a picture of you in your uniform to kind of compare of like, here what the guys look like, kind of what Matt looks like, as in his reenactment military uniform. I think that'd look pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would find that very interesting, including me, to look at, just to kind of give people a visual aid of what we're kind of talking about.
Right.
Because it's, a lot of this, like I say, is I can picture a lot of this, I can imagine myself there, but a lot of times it's cool to see these old images plus what the new images of today. It's like, you get to see it black and white, and then you get to see, possibly matte in color. So it looks pretty cool.
Right.
Because one time when Matt was doing reenacting in the First World War at the Illinois Military Museum, we went out there, and he was representing the German military at that time, and it was pretty neat. That was probably like already 3 or 4 years ago. And just the rifle and the bayonet alone.
Yeah, I remember that was taller than Bree.
Yeah, it was taller than my fiance. The rifle and bayonet attached, which honestly we can put that picture on there too, just as another visual. And Matt even had his gas mask on with that, which was pretty cool, with the German gas mask, helmet, and rifle. But anyway, kind of shifting the conversation a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there any fun or interesting accomplishments that you found during your research for the 33rd Division?
I think probably one of the more interesting things that I've ran across doing research at the military museum. Of course, I scanned all of the paperwork. that I cataloged when I interned there. By which I mean I went back and recently scanned it, because when I got into World War I was like, I know they got a lot of stuff there that I want to see. So I went there and I did that. I've also started looking through some of their other collections there of what else they have. And I actually ran across, talk about the 131st again, a one-time published memoir from a veteran of Company H of the 131st Infantry. Um, it was just mixed in with some other random stuff, and it's about, I think, 50 or 60 pages, and the front page says from, I can't remember what his name was, but from Dad to whatever his daughter's name was, Christmas Day 1940. It was this, he typed out what he did in World War I and then gave it to his daughter as a Christmas present in 1940.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And then in the front of it, it has, a nice little cutout picture of him. And then it also has his original uniform patch glued in there as well.
Wow.
And reading it, you kind of get an idea for how people talked back then.
Yeah.
He has a very stylistic type of writing. So yeah, I'd say that's probably, I don't know if you could call that an accomplishment per se, but
one thing when I was kind of reading, which was kind of interesting, I know you've mentioned to me previously before, but I think I'm probably going to butcher this a little bit, but they met the King or the Queen of England?
Yeah.
Elaborate that?
Yeah, so the Battle of Hamel, which I talked about earlier, as I said, the 33rd was the only division to fight under the Australians, the British, and the French. And the King of England, King George V, personally decorated the men from the four companies of the 131st and the 132nd who fought at Hamel. And that was the only time that King George actually decorated anybody in the AEF.
That's to me very crazy. Like,
yeah.
Some random Illinois farm boys get decorated by the King of England after a battle. Like that to me is very, very interesting. Like, that's something I find very cool, and something that, again, that's not talked about. And you said, I don't think, does that even happen even in like the Second World War? I mean,
I have no idea.
That's what I'm saying. And that's kind of crazy. Like, these guys actually get to meet the King of England. He personally decorates them with what? Medals?
I'm not sure which medals exactly, but yes.
Which I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's kind of crazy to think about that. As you said, some Illinois farm boys. I mean, even though most of the guys from the 131st were from Chicago, so city boys, but yeah.
But still,
nevertheless.
The suburbs of Chicago, I mean, they weren't all just from, were they all from in Chicago?
I mean, there were definitely guys outside of Chicago who got put in with the 131st. How many, I couldn't exactly tell you.
Okay, well, some farm and city boys.
Yeah. Some Illinoisans, let's just go with that.
Which is still, just mind-blowing little fun fact that I love, which I think is so cool. And like you said earlier, I think the most gas regiment is also a very interesting fact. And, And so kind of going off that too, like I kind of asked you earlier, any future plans of research that you're going to focus on?
I mean, definitely going to continue working with what I'm doing now with, the roster, with finding all the individuals, because the passenger list, there's one from when they went overseas, and then there's one when they came back home. They probably received some replacements over there at some point, and I'd like to find out who they were too. So definitely, want to get information on them. Definitely researching at the National Archives when I'm able to get those death records I had mentioned, and then coordinating with other researchers out east, the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, which is where most of the actual military unit records are based at. By unit records, I mean after action reports, quartermaster reports, things of that nature. So.
Wow, sounds like you got a lot of research and work ahead of you.
I do, and that's the thing. I feel like there's a lot of stuff in here that I can't necessarily answer just because I am still in that collection phase, I guess you could say.
You're doing a little bit of both,
Yeah. But no, it's definitely it's been fun, and with reenacting specifically, like, I've been doing this long enough that there's groups out there that don't necessarily take themselves to this level of in-depth research and trying to actually find about the men that they're portraying. And the nice thing with doing World War One is I'm doing my own thing. I've got maybe 2 or 3 other guys who I can hang out with and do this with and share this with, and they'll take as much of an interest in it as I do. But at the end of the day, we can just do our own thing.
And that's the exciting thing. And I just think that your love and passion for history is so fascinating, and so I'm trying to think of the word. I'm drawing a blank, but more intriguing and motivating to younger generations. Because I love doing research and understanding these different important things of history and Illinois history. I don't get to really live it like you do.
Right.
You do all the research, and then you actually go out and educate. Like explain one of the reenactment events that you would do for World War One.
I mean,
who comes out to these things? Is it like older people, young people, mix?
It's a mix. As far as reenactors are concerned, reenacting really goes back to, I think, Civil War reenacting started in the 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
World War II around 70s, 80s. World War I around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And, as far as like the people that come out to it, again, it's just a mix of everybody. I think generally speaking, an older crowd, but there's definitely, younger people who come out as well. As far as like what actually happens there, like as I was saying earlier, like I don't really do the battles per se. I'm more about getting the details right and, creating an accurate representation of what I'm portraying and talking to people about, who these people were, like what I'm talking about now.
And that's what I was going to ask. Do you educate these people? And do people actually find it interesting?
Yeah, I think it depends on who you get. I mean, I think especially younger people typically, want to know about the guns and stuff like that. But, like poison gas. Like I carry a gas mask with me. Here's why I carry it. Here's what it, when I put it on, I have to wear this mouthpiece and this nose clip. And yeah, it's me wearing it, not you, but just imagine having to wearing this thing for hours on end. And then, you can talk about the effects of gas. You can talk about, what we were talking about earlier with, the fact that the 33rd was, I believe, the most gassed unit in the American Expeditionary Forces. So you can talk about all of that based on just this one piece of equipment that I'm carrying.
Yeah.
And then, like the trench knives I was talking about earlier. Well, why are they carrying them? Well, because they got in close quarters combat a lot. And,
and it was rifle, ferocious.
And a bolt-action rifle can be very unwieldy. So,
and you get, bolt-action rifle ain't going to save your life in hand-to-hand combat. So yeah, just little stuff like that, and then of course some people, actually geek out on the actual history as well. So yeah, I think as far as like why I'm doing all this, obviously I'm a nerd. I find this stuff interesting. I do this this research for fun, but ultimately I do it to enhance my hobby and my portrayal and my representation. So my question for you. I've always wanted to ask you this. I've never really asked you this question before, Matt. And I think this is the proper stage to do it. We'll have it in front of not really a live audience, but in front of an audience to hear. Do you ever plan on either writing a book, or anything along those lines, because you are such, in my opinion, a wealth of knowledge when it comes to not even say the First World War, say the Second World War, any research you've conducted. I know that you've been published previously at Lincoln Land Community College.
Yeah, I had a English essay that I wrote actually. Was published in the Lincoln Land Review back in, I want to say it was 2016. Because, I graduated.
Yeah, that sounds about.
I graduated 2017, so I think 2016. And ultimately, do I want to publish anything one day? If I do, it's certainly going to be, my great uncle's unit in World War II. But the simple fact is, even with that, I've been doing that for close to 10 years now. I'm still in the collection phase of that. Because whenever like you look at Panda Brothers, when Stephen Ambrose wrote that, which was in the 80s or 90s, all those guys were still around. Like, he had them to talk to and tell the stories. I'm 26 years old in 2022.
Yeah.
There's only 2 veterans from his company left. Fortunately, I've interviewed 4 of them. 2 just recently passed away. But, as far as writing a book, I really want to tell their story. And part of doing that, actually really the main way of doing that, is through their own words, through letters, which are in the possession of families. And I have to find those families, and that's a task on its own. So,
and hopefully they're still alive, they're in contact. Family's alive, but I mean the letters are in still existence, is what I'm trying to say.
Like there's some families that I'd contact them and be like, yeah, sorry, we don't have anything. There's others where it's like we've got every single letter that he wrote was 2 years overseas. One, sad to say, I thought this veteran was still alive. Yeah. And I wrote a letter. And then I didn't hear anything back for a while, so I gave a phone call. And got his daughter, and she said, are you the one that wrote the letter? Yeah, I'm sorry he passed away, but, she really wanted to help me. Like, she was infatuated with what I was doing. And, she said, yeah, well, I'm still going through Dad's stuff after he passed away, because that's a task on its own.
Yeah.
And a couple of years went by. I reached out earlier this year and got got her caretaker. She had cancer and she passed away.
Wow.
But her caretaker said she always wanted you to have this stuff. So I'm going through it all. I'm going to gather it all together and I'm going to give it to you. Stuff like that is it's really humbling. It brings home like what I'm doing. The fact that this person that I've never met wants me to have, this stuff from her father.
That's really unbelievable just hearing that, and that's how you preserve history.
Yeah.
And Matt, you are, in my opinion, a living historian that's doing the best of your knowledge, to help keep these stories alive, because a lot of times these things end up in a dumpster and lost forever.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I appreciate it. I'm just doing my passion, and like I said at the very beginning, to kind of tie it all in, it's all about the personal history. It's about my great uncle. He was wounded twice. He also received 2 Bronze Stars, and he just never talked about it. I remember my grandma, she has a picture of my grandfather, I think 2 or 3 of my great uncles, and a couple of their friends at a bar here in Springfield. Had to have been 1946, because my grandpa is in his Navy Blues, and he was in 46 and 47. Yeah. My grandpa's got this big smile on his face. One of the other guys does as well. And then my great uncle and one of his buddies, they're just got this blank stare in the camera. And years later, in the 90s, all the brothers got together, and my grandma brought that picture out and said, oh, hey, here's a picture from back in the day when you were all together. And she said she felt so bad because my great uncle looked like he was about to start crying because he just couldn't recognize himself, because it was right after the war. He knew what he was going through. And of course, I know this is going off the rails a little bit with World War II instead of World War One. But I mean, as far as like any publication is concerned, that's definitely something I want to do in the future. But again, it's a massive amount of research that needs to be conducted in order to really convey the story that I want to tell. So,
And I know the pandemic kind of put a couple year halt on that, you know, and which the National Archives being closed, that doesn't help. And I know, you know, like you said, we got off a little bit on tangent, but I would love to have you back on for another episode to talk about your great uncle's unit, because I'm so fascinated with that as well, because that's World War II, Pacific Theater. You have done tons and tons of research, tons and tons of talking, interviewing people. I'd love to hear their stories. We could definitely save that for another time, because that's a whole other episode on its own.
It is, for sure.
But yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you coming on, Matt. Is there anything else you would like to talk about that we didn't get to discuss or bring up last minute?
I mean, maybe just a little bit about American involvement in World War One in general.
Yes,
I think
it's very important. Let's talk about that.
Because I think, like you mentioned earlier, you know, World War One is definitely like that period in American history that's just kind of overshadowed.
Unfortunately.
And I know, like, it was something I really didn't even care about for the longest time. And I would say, you know, if there's anything for anybody listening to this to take away, what I would direct you to do is to go on Amazon and buy a book called The Last of the Doughboys. It's written by Richard Rubin in, I want to say 2008. I can't remember.
It's fairly recent.
Yeah. But what this guy did, he goes into a lot about public memory of World War One and the fact that after the war, you know, if you look at pretty much any town in America, small or big,
yes,
there's probably a World War One monument. Like,
I agree, because like here, just going off that example, like if you go to a lot of small towns in Illinois, which I travel to a lot for work,
right,
like a town of maybe say 800 people, the town square has a World War One memorial for the men that served or died, and this is a lot in Illinois. And then this even goes farther out, like a couple like 10 years ago, I went to Pennsylvania with my parents, and we went to a small town to visit some old neighbors, all that fun stuff. Guess what was there? A World War One memorial, like Matt just said.
It's
kind of interesting, like you said.
Back when I still reenacted German, we actually went to a reenactment in Newville, Pennsylvania, which is the World War One reenactment to go to. They own their own property. It's an actual. Each side has their own trench system, dugouts, machine gun pits. There's a no man's land.
Really?
It's pretty cool.
That sounds awesome.
But we stopped off at a rest stop outside of Pittsburgh. And at this rest stop, there was a little plaque to a Pennsylvania unit in World War One.
Yeah.
But to get back to what I was saying, like, you know, America really, after the war, went to great lengths to memorialize it, to remember it. And then World War II happened, and we just kind of forgot it.
Yeah, World War II happens, 20 years later, basically?
Yeah.
And just overshadows the memory of World War I.
And but The Last of the Doughboys, the reason I recommend people read it, besides the...
I need to add that to my reading list.
Yeah, besides the public memory that he delves into, he went around interviewing the last World War I veterans in the early 2000s. So these guys were well over 100 by this point. And he actually, I think he went to the VA, and he asked them if they had a list of surviving World War I veterans. And they said they think there were tens of thousands left. And then after they went through it, ended up being there were only a few hundred or maybe 1,000 left.
Wow.
And so the French government in the late 90s and early 2000s actually made it a point to go around and decorate any veteran that wanted to, any surviving American World War I veteran with a medal that served overseas in France. and with the help of contact from the French government, got a list of surviving veterans and went around and interviewed them. And there's just so many great stories in that book. And, this is from a generation that even at that point in the 90s and early 2000s, nobody cared about.
Yeah.
So, and he even, there's a point that he makes in there, I think, in the beginning. There was a veteran of I want to say the 26th Division, the Yankee Division.
So northern.
Yeah. Well, they were out east, out of Massachusetts area.
So they're
Rhode Island, I believe.
Yanks. They're Yanks.
Yeah, they're Yanks. But they were nicknamed the Yankee Division. But there was a 26th Division veteran in a Veterans Day parade, and he was in a car or a truck or whatever, waving to people in the crowd, still wearing his uniform and his helmet from 100 years. That point, 80, 90 years ago.
Yeah.
And he says, as all this parade is going on, what these people don't realize is this is the last Veterans Day parade to feature a living World War I veteran, which is really poignant because, the whole reason Veterans Day exists is November 11th was Armistice Day before it was Veterans Day.
Yes.
So, yeah, I would encourage anybody, who wants to kind of start delving around into World War I history a little bit to certainly start with that book. Of course, that's just the American experience. And, you also have the British experience, French, Germans,
Russian, Italian,
Turkish,
World War I involved the world.
It was a world war.
It was
a global conflict.
Like, I was watching a thing pretty recently, and even Japan started their conquest of Asia during the First World War.
Right.
It's just.
And I think even
the Australians, like you mentioned, are fighting.
Even the I always found this to be really interesting. The Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam.
Yes,
he talks about
one of my favorites.
He talks about Ho Chi Minh and trying to get Vietnam
recognized at the armistice
right after World War I.
And and honestly, what's just so sad, this is another little tangent, you can honestly blame the United States prior, like you said, years and years before, for causing Vietnam in 1918, which is very scary to believe.
Yeah.
Because and Ho Chi Minh was a very pro-U.S. person, and we kind of just said, you're Asian, uneducated, and you're basically an animal. We're not going to recognize you. Yeah. Which is really sad.
Right.
But that was the mentality back then, unfortunately.
It's one of the other things that I find fascinating about World War I is it really created the world we live in today.
Yes.
That and World War II. You have, the Russian Empire
falls.
The Russian monarchy falls and becomes communist Russia.
Yes.
The German Empire ceases to exist and ends up with Hitler.
Yes.
The British Empire exists, but is not nearly as strong as it used to be.
The Turkish Empire falls.
Yeah, Ottoman Empire doesn't exist. The Middle East is now...
Basically, the French Empire kind of goes away too.
Yeah.
It was the last imperial war in human history.
I think one of the best ways I've heard it described, I can't remember where I saw it, but it called World War I the last argument of kings.
Yes.
I thought that summarized it perfectly.
Yes. and here's 2 points I want to bring out real quick. You tell everyone to basically go out and do their own research, which I 100% agree, which I've kind of not done to a very far extent because I'm doing tons of my own research, like you guys will see. That's the
thing. Other periods in history.
Yes, which
so much.
Yes, I love learning about war and the stories of the soldiers, but I like to focus on tons of other different things, which you guys have already seen with this podcast, with all kinds of different little small stories that are kind of forgotten about. But anyway, when I went to one of our local antique shops, I found a book on all the World War One veterans or soldiers that fought in Sangamon County, which is the county we're from, which is Springfield. And I want to do some personal research on some of those individuals, which is a huge book. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember did you actually buy that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, those at Sangamon Antique Mall. I used to go there all the time when I lived in town. Yeah, I remember that. I saw that book there, and I was getting.
You've even looked at it. I've showed it to you.
Yeah, I
it's
remember.
Huge.
Well, before you bought it, I remember one day I was leaving, and then I saw something Sangamon County in the World War, and I was like, "That's interesting." And took a look at it. So I was like $100 or something. I'm like, it's not that interesting to me.
Yeah, they actually lowered. So you saw it for 100. I actually got it for 40, which is I think that's kind of fair for a book that's looks like probably from the 40s, I'd say, or 50s. I may be a little later, but
I think that was published in the 20s.
I may even be wrong. I haven't really. Honestly, the sad thing is I bought the book.
Haven't looked at it.
Haven't looked at it, which is actually kind of sad. But I'll also include this in the Instagram post. It's a huge, thick book, and it's pretty cool. Like, I've looked up to see if I even had any relatives. Unfortunately, not. But anyway, I thought that was a really cool little add-on to this story. And the other thing, now I forgot the other thing I was going to bring up.
I can actually say that book, going back to when I was originally looking at which units I wanted to portray, I was originally looking for guys from Springfield to see if there was a company from Springfield. There wasn't.
But it does say that the 33rd Division did come to Springfield a couple times to do some training, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think there's, at the military museum, there's actually pictures of them training at Camp Lincoln. But anyhow, I actually found that book. That book is actually digitized online.
Are you serious?
I am dead serious. Because when I was looking...
Wow. I feel so defeated now.
When I was looking for which unit I wanted to do, I was going through looking at guys in there who were in the 33rd, and I found that book on Google, and I'm like, oh, I know what that book is. And then I ended up finding a picture of my relative in there,
which is really cool.
He was on my dad's side. I'm trying to remember. So my great grandmother's sister's husband is who it was.
Yeah.
His name was George Eganet, and he was in a field artillery unit of the 84th Division, which did not see action. The 84th was one of those, what they called replacement units. Basically, they came over as a division, and then guys were pieced out to different units that needed them for combat. But yeah, it was cool because, I found his headstone. He's buried at Camp Butler here in town. I found his headstone. And I'm like, oh, I had somebody in World War I. It was fascinating. It's like, all this time, I never thought I had anybody in World War I. And then I found him. And then I looked at that book online. And I'm like, hey, I've got a picture of him now. So,
and really, my last final question to you, which is another big argument with, I've had with friends and family. I just remember my other point. Is, do you really think the United States made a major impact on the First World War to help win the war?
Yes.
You think they turned the tide?
I don't know about turning the tide, but definitely made the war end quicker. Yeah. My rationale behind this is very simply, of course, we were already helping to supply the Allies before we even got involved. Yeah. In fact, I distinctly remember in history class back in high school, our history teacher at the time, she was like, yeah, the Germans were torpedoing American ships, and she's like, it's secret. We were sending stuff to the Allies. And I'm like, so they weren't entirely unjustified.
The Lusitania may have had 10 tons of explosives underneath it that was being shipped to Britain. God only knows.
But back to my point. So we were already helping to supply the Allies before we even got involved. However, by the time American combat troops actually saw action in 1918, all of the European powers were not only tired but also bled dry of manpower.
Yeah.
I mean, not entirely. I mean, they were saying, they were thinking that the war was still going to go on into 1919.
And Germany kind of had the edge, it seemed like, a little bit.
Well, at the very beginning with the Kaiserschlacht, the March 1918 offensive, French and British got kind of scared there for a little bit, thinking the Germans were going to turn it. But with us getting involved, of course, yes, we hadn't experienced modern warfare yet. Yes, we were green when we went in. But nevertheless, we had 1 million men in France by the end of the war, which is a massive amount of manpower, of fresh troops and materials and supplies.
And like you said, or like we talked about, looking at the casualties just from one battle, the Air Gun Force, which was a major battle. U.S. take about from this division regiment, 5,000 divisions.
I mean, 5,000 gas casualties in this one period.
And that's what I'm saying.
Well, that wasn't the division. That was the entire
regiment.
Third Corps.
Third Corps. And that's what I'm saying. So you look at that, and that just shows you we were able to help turn the tide, because that's just, like you said, gas casualties, let alone artillery, gun, tank, whatever you want to call it.
I think the biggest flaw in your question, that this isn't necessarily you, I think this is a lot of people.
Yes.
When they ask that question, what they really mean is, did the United States actually do anything? Because, I mean, who bore the brunt of the war? Absolutely the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians.
The Russians.
Yeah.
The Austrians.
But did we help to end it, to make it end quicker, I guess I should say?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. There's almost no...
Yeah, that's an argument we've had. People have brought up with me, family, not family, friends. And I understand it is a broad question, but I think it's interesting because, I was curious what your point was on that.
Yeah, it's a good question, but, I think...
It's a fun question.
I think a lot of people, they... especially Europeans, are like, oh, those damn Americans think that they just came in and won World War I and World War II, and
I have the back-to-back. I should honestly
back-to-back World War champs.
I dropped the opportunity. I should have wore that. Oh my god, I'm so mad at myself.
I'm mad at myself. I used to have one of those shirts. I went to a reenactment, got changed into my uniform, and then never saw it again.
Well, I don't
know what happened.
I still have mine. I wear it loud and proud, baby.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's a valid question. But I think if anybody really wants to, I guess you could say, envision the impact that America had on the war, I would encourage them to go look up video on YouTube by the Great War Channel.
Yes, that's what I was watching.
Back during the centennial, the 100th anniversary in 2014 to 2018. I can't remember the guy's name. Indy Nidell, that was his name. The guy who hosts the show. He actually did an episode where he went to the, I believe it's the Meuse Argonne Cemetery.
Yep.
Which is huge.
Can only imagine.
And is all American dead from World War I in this area. In that area in France that are buried there. Highly recommend people go watch that video. Really helps you to see.
We'll link it.
We can link it.
We'll link it in the description.
But you can definitely go there, go watch that video and just see, like, when you see that many crosses side by side. I mean, it's kind of. I mean, it doesn't only just hit you necessarily emotionally, but also just shows you the scale of our involvement. So yeah, that's really that's what I got for that. So,
well, I really appreciate sitting down and talking to you for actually quite a while, Matt.
Yeah, we're gonna have to release this in parts. It's been
it's been a good time. I've loved learning about the First World War, the 129th, the 33rd, the 131st, the Corps, all the above. is there anything, if you want anyone that listening today want to follow you on any social media or anything along those lines, you want to put that out there or no?
No, I don't really have any social media pages. The only one, going back to World War II again, I do have a World War II Facebook page called 37th Infantry Division in World War II. Actually haven't posted on a while, just with other stuff that's come up in life.
Yeah. We'll still link it anyway.
Yeah, fair enough.
We'll put a link in. Like I said, guys, I'll make a post on Instagram and possibly Facebook. We'll see on just images of what we talked about today and Matt kind of in this reenactment stuff. And we'll go from there. And we really appreciate everyone listening. And we will definitely have Matt back on. It was a great experience, and I'm wanting to know more.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed being here. I thank you for having me, buddy, and we'll definitely do it again sometime. So
I can't wait.
It's been a pleasure.